This session is called Connection and Community and the Language Classroom. And for those of you who don't know me, I will be focusing on my experience teaching children. But I believe also that what I'm going to be sharing today applies to learners of every age. Let me turn on my video here so I can say hi to people properly. Hello, hello. Yes, I've met a lot of people from Spain because I've been dedicated to ELT since 2001, and like she just mentioned, I'm currently based in Sao Paulo, but I spent a decade in Spain, and some of my best years were there working at Oxford TEFL in Barcelona, where I was the director of studies for years. Since then, I've done a range of different things, but I've always been most passionate about teaching children. And nowadays, I'm the director of Active English. We provide training pathways for young learner teachers and have a really engaged community online that I'm super proud of. I've also stepped back into the classroom again this year after a short break, and I'm working with pre-primary. So I have to say that I think my topic today has never been more relevant for young learner teachers. But again, I think a lot of things, you can tell me, I think a lot of things that I'm going to talk about can apply to learners of all ages. I'm going to be talking about this sense of connection and community and how this can contribute to creating the kind of classroom environment which really supports the learning process. Specifically, what we're going to talk about, because this topic is huge, isn't it? Like, there's so much that we could talk about, but I want to just focus on one thing today, and that's relationship building. Specifically, having a look at group formation. This is something that's had a huge impact on my teaching and has been an integral part of my lessons for years. And I hope today it'll also inspire you to put relationships at the forefront of your teaching, if perhaps this is something that has been a secondary consideration, because relationships are, after all, the foundation of everything that we do in our classroom. It is the first step, thinking specifically about young learners now, it's the first step for good classroom management, for successful group work, social emotional learning. It's important for working with big groups, with multi-level groups and more. They always talk about putting relationships first, establishing good relationships. So as you listen to this talk, your challenge is going to be to make connections between the ideas that I'll be sharing and your context and how they could be applied or adapted for your situation. Before we do get started, though, there's something I think is really important to share with you all about me, just to contextualize what I'm talking about. There I am. Recently, I was asked to write about my approach to teaching children, and it made me think right back to my early days and the journey I've taken from classrooms in different parts of the world, Australia, England, Spain, Italy, and finally to my arrival in Brazil. I thought about when I did my diploma at Oxford TEFL, thought about all the research I've read and the people that I've worked with and those teaching experiences and the students that have influenced and shaped me as a professional. And then I reflected on all of this and I tried to write how I teach English to children in one paragraph. Yeah, that was a really interesting exercise to do. And if you haven't done that, I encourage that you do it. Because I did walk away from that with a really clear insight into something. What I realized is that I don't think I teach language anymore. I know that might sound strange, but to be honest, I don't think I've taught language for a long time. I teach children, or I teach people, right? And I think when I made the shift from teaching language to teaching people, I became a much better version of my professional self. I've certainly become much more fulfilled with the work that I do, which used to be a lot about vocabulary lists and grammar rules. And what I'm going to really share reflects my beliefs. Because while at the end goal is to have my learners speaking English, it's certainly not my only goal. I'd like to think that I teach the whole child, and speaking a foreign language is just one of the outcomes of those lessons. I think there are more and more English teachers making this transition, so it's quite possible that you can relate to what I'm saying. But if you believe that your primary goal is to just teach vocabulary and grammar to children, then you might not connect with what I'm going to be sharing. And that's why I've taken this time to explain all of this first. And I'm curious to know what your beliefs about teaching are. Are we on the same page with this? Please post in the comments there and make sure you read and reply to the other comments there too. Let's get a little discussion going. I'll pull the chat up here, pop it over here to the side. Great, so Jackie's on the same page with me as well, as is Caro, Teresa. Great, excellent. So yeah, we don't have a lot of time to be doing the whole reflection on your career and your approach to teaching children, or your approach to teaching, but perhaps you, like me, can connect with this idea of teaching the whole person rather than just focusing on language as if it was somehow separate to our lives. So I wanted to get that clear before we talk about our current context. And there can be no doubt in my mind that 2020 was the toughest year that teachers and students have ever faced, at least in our lifetime, here in Brazil, in my very privileged context. But this is definitely, I think, true for a lot of people. Without wanting to talk too much about the pandemic, because we're all sick of the topic, but I do want to say that even though schools reopened in 2021, we're far from being back to normal. In fact, we're now having to deal with repercussions of everything that's happened. And I was just talking to some colleagues recently about how hard it is to be in such a context now where there is so much insecurity. What's going to happen? Are we going back to class in face-to-face, or will we do hybrid, or are we going online? I wonder if it's the same there in Catalonia. Educators around the world are facing these new sets of challenges, and it is my hope that once again our teaching community will come together to learn and share and support each other, and maybe even use this whole pandemic as a catalyst for some much needed change in the way we teach language to children. It's become painfully clear, at least to me, that a shift in mindset and pedagogy is what we urgently need. And we need to do more than just address the gaps in academic learning that were caused by the closing of schools, which is another big problem. But we need to start making mental health and well-being and relationships a real priority for teachers and students. I love how Barry Carpenter puts this. He says we need a systemic relationships-based approach to reigniting the flame of learning in each child. I love how that sounds. And yeah, for those of you who haven't heard of Barry Carpenter, he's an expert on mental health in education, and he published this think piece that I came across in 2020. It was called A Recovery Curriculum, Loss and Life for Our Children and Schools Post-Pandemic. And in it, he advocates for this more humane approach that focuses on well-being and positive development of the child. In fact, this same idea seems to be central to most conversations about post-pandemic teaching and learning. And this makes perfect sense to me. It's never been more important to think about how we as educators can build this healthy classroom environment which supports the emotional well-being of the individual learning process of each child or student. And for this, we need to start talking about relationships. Positive relationships are vital for child development, and we all know this. And there's a lot of loss that has been experienced during the pandemic. Think about it. It's loss of contact with peers. How many birthdays and cultural events have they missed out on participating in? So re-establishing, reconnecting with friendships, with the staff at the school. I think this quote also from Barry Carpenter is really, really relevant to all of us. So let's now take a look at what it's like to be adapting to this so-called new normal for many of us teachers. And it may be reassuring for you all to know that in my experience, through connecting with teachers from classrooms in many different parts of the world, like hundreds and hundreds of teachers, we've got 10,000 teachers in the Instagram community alone now. And every day I hear and listen to and talk to teachers who are participating in these groups to sort of share the kinds of problems that we're having. And in 2020 and 2021, I started collecting quotes. And some of these I think are interesting for us to look at to see if you recognize any of these situations. These come from real young learner teachers. So I want you to read these quotes, and I've got a little task for you to do here. Do any of these situations sound familiar, at least? Maybe not the exact same thing, something familiar. Maybe you have your own quote that you'd like to share in the comments. But I want you to take it further than that. I want you to have a look at these situations that these teachers have found themselves in, and think about the consequences of this problem. What is going to be the consequence on the classroom environment, or on the individual child, or on the class dynamics, or on the learning that can take place? I'm going to do one example for you here with this first quote. My students love competitions. It's the only way to motivate them. And we know with a lot of this gaming culture, a lot of teachers have really dived into this idea of making everything a game and a competition of points, and collecting badges and collecting this. And if that becomes the only way to motivate students, having them compete against each other, at some point, I believe that there is going to be a really, there will be negative consequences on the learning environment. And I suspect that what happens here is that every time you have a competition, there are going to be winners and losers. And depending on what your competitions are like, if you have competitions that are based on their ability to produce language, for example, then you're going to quickly find that within your class, you will have students who have a lower level of proficiency. Perhaps they're already self-conscious about their ability to speak in English. And if they're always feeling like they're losers, that's going to have a direct impact on their identity as language learners, and certainly on their willingness to participate and how they feel about themselves in general. And I think that this is really problematic. I wonder what you think there. Let's have a look at the messages over here. What do you think happens when students or when teachers give up on group work because there's always a 5? Love what Kara's just said, talking about cooperation and not competition. That is completely linked to what we're talking about here today. What do you think happens when, what's the consequence of not addressing this, when you've got this problem where you've got one child in the class who no one gets on with, or nobody likes? What are the consequences of that? This next one I think is, this next one here I think is really relevant to teaching adults, especially. Who hasn't had an adult in their class who doesn't want to speak because of their low level of proficiency, and because they don't speak, they don't improve, and they don't improve, so they don't speak, and it's this vicious cycle. Has anyone here tried a behavior chart? Okay, Marta has used a word that I absolutely love here. If you don't have a safe classroom environment, they won't take risks. How important is risk-taking to language learning? Marta also hates behavior charts. I have used a lot of behavior charts at the start of my career in desperation, and it never ended well. It didn't bring about the long-term change that I needed to see. Well, I think these quotes are really interesting, and we're going to be having a look at them again in a future moment here. But I want us to move forward now, and I want us to have a look at why relationships are so important in the classroom. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here a little bit, so I don't need to spend too much time talking about this, but I will say this, that people, this is another quote that I absolutely love, and it's because it's integral to our existence to feel a sense of belonging in our families, and that's whoever that includes for you, the cultural group you identify with, and in your wider community as well. I don't need to tell the Catalans about that, do I? These relationships are what define us, and therefore, especially in childhood, but all throughout life, they are central to forming our identity, who we are and who we can become. And this can, and I think it must happen in our school communities too. But I'm not about to forget that we're also language teachers. So if you think all of this isn't relevant for you, I think I'm going to invite you to think again, because for many students, particularly those learning a foreign language for the first time, the English language classroom can actually be a very, I'm not going to say threatening, but certainly an unfamiliar place that may cause them levels of fear and anxiety. I've certainly felt this when I've gone to learn something new before. And this fear and anxiety can have negative repercussions on a student's willingness and ability to engage in what you're trying to teach them. So if you've got students in your classroom who are feeling really anxious or nervous, it's going to be hard for them to learn anything in your classroom, even if you've prepared an amazing lesson. The fear and anxiety is just one example of how the way students feel can affect their ability to learn. There are many problems that arise, particularly in the young learner classroom, that when we don't deal with them effectively, they can all lead to serious consequences for the teaching and learning process. Let's think back to those quotes. They may first appear, let's actually skip back to them. At first, it may appear that they're all very, very different, right? They're different situations. But I found that they all have one thing in common. These situations would all improve from better relationships. And that's why from the start of the school year, or for you folks, the start of the calendar year, I think it's really, this is what I do. I set objectives that focus first and foremost on building healthy relationships, not just between the teacher and the students. We hear a lot about teacher-student rapport. But also between the students themselves. The student-student relationship is super important, super important. And for some reason, we don't hear a lot about it. It's certainly not something that appears in course books explicitly. We do hear a lot about getting to know your students, finding out what their needs are. Don't get me wrong, this is all important as well, but if you don't have really strong, healthy student-student relationships, it can make your teaching really, really impossible. This isn't something that I've sort of invented either. There's so much research that supports the idea of putting relationships first. If you just dig a little deeper into this topic, you're even going to find whole communities of educators who are campaigning with the hashtag, I don't know whether you've seen it, the hashtag Maslow before Bloom. So if this is making sense to you, reach out and connect with people online, and you're going to find lots of support and resources so that you can incorporate this more and more into your teaching practice. There are, like I said, there are so many different and important ways to work on relationships, to build community, to build connection. But there's no way I could address all of those in this one session. So I've chosen to focus on something. Just one specific thing. It's group formation. Have you ever read something that has had a profound impact on the way that you teach? Because that's what happened when I discovered group formation activities in a book which is co-authored by David Vail. Thanks, Farrell, for participating so actively there in the chat. I've got the chat up on my screen, folks, so if you want to talk to me or share or interact there in the chat, go ahead. So this is one of the things that really impacted me. In this, there's sort of this, it's almost like an article within the book, and in it he actually quotes Krashen really when he's referring to this idea of lowering the affective barriers that can impede our ability to learn. And he points out the importance of learners feeling comfortable enough with each other to, and here's that word again, to take risks, just like Martha said earlier. They have to be comfortable enough with each other to take risks with the language, make mistakes with the language, without fearing being ridiculed by peers or the teacher, or overcorrected as well. Children, they do tend to thrive in classrooms. Not just children, everyone tends to thrive in classrooms where they feel valued and respected as individuals, as well as this sense of belonging in the group. And when we have this, when we have created this healthy atmosphere, this strong foundation, this naturally leads to more cooperative work. And it's in this kind of supportive environment that new language can be processed within the group. And this, as David points out in the article, this greatly facilitates the work of the teacher. Let me repeat that last part. It greatly facilitates the work of the teacher. When I read that, well, that was it. That was enough to make me rethink a lot of things that I was doing, because it is a struggle, you know. Every course book requires you to put students in groups to work. You know, group work is such an important part of our teaching practice today. This idea of having student-centered learning going on. But group work, really proper collaborative group work, is not just the same as putting kids into groups to work together. Really collaborative group work requires collaborative and cooperative relationships. That's something else that someone here in I think it was Carl mentioned this about cooperation. It was cooperation, not competition. Getting people to cooperate is really difficult. Here are some of the main points from the book, and there's David Vale's name. Folks, I have a slide at the end as well with all of my references and further reading for anyone who's interested in diving a bit deeper into these topics that I'm talking about. Yeah, so taking risks, not being afraid of being made fun of or overcorrected. This leads to more cooperative work, and it makes our jobs easier when it's more student-centered. Now, that's the way it should be. So when I read about this, it really felt like a concept that was a potential solution for a lot of the problems that I was facing at the time. And you look at these kids in this photograph here, these were my kids. I was actually, this was an incredibly problematic group at the beginning. You wouldn't guess from their lovely smiling faces in these photos. But I had a group that had mixed ages, and I had a group that went to the same school together and brought with them the relationship dynamics, the unhealthy relationship dynamics that they had there together. And it was really, really hard. And it was these sort of long 3-hour classes after school. I had some really shy kids, one particular, very, very shy girl. So I wanted to help these sort of reluctant speakers feel safe making mistakes. I wanted to improve this group's ability to work cooperatively. And so I began using group formation activities straight away. And the results were so positive that now they're an integral part of all of the lessons that I teach, the courses that I design. I even use group formation when I'm doing workshops with adults. And even I've started writing them into the course books that I work on for children. So this is something which I really stand by as being an effective solution to a lot of the problems that we're facing. If you've read this article already from David Vale, it's a short read. I was considering bringing it along to getting people to read it, but I'll just summarize it. If you read this article, you'll very quickly realize, and in fact, maybe you already have realized, these aren't just fun games. Okay, there is a difference between a group formation activity and a fun game. Group formation activities have very specific characteristics that make them different from typical icebreakers that you might see at the start of a course or games that you might use in a regular class. If you do this sort of quick search online for drama warmers or cooperative games, this is a really good starting point for finding ideas. However, not all of these will be appropriate for the specific purpose of group formation, so do take care. It's important that you're able to tell the difference so that you can start building up a bank of activities that you can use throughout the school year. And I'd like us I'd like us to give this a try now. Here are some questions, some guiding questions that you can ask yourself. I want you to, this is the activity that I'd like you to do. I want you to think of a game that you suspect might be a good activity for building strong relationships or building healthy relationships among the learners. So have a think of one of those games. Even type it here in the chat. And then we can actually analyze one of these games together. The game doesn't need to meet all of the criteria. Aha. Find someone who. This is a good one. So everybody is familiar with the classic find someone who. And I think this is a good example. Alicia, thank you so much for popping that in the chat. I'm going to assume that everyone knows the classic find someone who. So you've got a list of, yeah, I'm going to assume that, and we're going to use these questions. So a find someone who activity, does it require the group to work cooperatively? I think absolutely yes, right? Do you agree with me that they need to cooperate because they're going to have to be able to communicate with each other, to be able to get ask and answer questions, to complete their list, but they need to find someone who for. Do they need to somehow act together, of course, in this dialogue that they have? They're not allowed to show each other, so they're going to rely on each other. They need to support each other to create this communicative connection as they speak to each other. Find ways of communicating. If one person doesn't understand, if the communication breaks down, how are they going to repair that? Do they make physical contact with each other in a gentle way? Not deliberately, but you could incorporate that into the game. That's one thing which is actually a bit different now because of a lot of the health and safety protocols. They might not be able to have physical contact. What could we use to replace that? Do they need to lend and receive trust? And does it create a highly enjoyable, non-competitive situation? I think I find someone who is a really good example of that. You can even try searching online for a group formation game. Like I said, you can Google, if you're not sure, if you haven't got any ideas, you can Google drama warmers or cooperative games. If you Google those, you're going to find lots of them. But again, please refer back to this particular list. I want to actually give you, speaking of find someone who, I want to give you a version of this that I have used. In fact, if you've ever participated in a workshop of mine in person, you probably will have played this game with me. It's called Walk, Don't Touch. And what I do is I invite everyone to participate in this activity as my sessions, normally when we're face-to-face, requires people to discuss something in pairs or in small groups. Even getting people to exchange ideas here in the chat with complete strangers, it can be very intimidating for some people. So I usually use Walk, Don't Touch as a quick activity to help lower that affective barrier. And honestly, the difference that it makes to the atmosphere in the room is incredible. In Brazil, people kiss each other when they greet each other as well. And I think that is absolutely amazing. Like, you know, if we've kissed, we can basically talk about anything, right? So I think that's something that, gosh, how COVID will have changed things now. But starting off an activity, getting everybody to circulate the room, starting off a session or a lesson, and I chant, walk, don't touch, walk, don't touch, walk, don't touch, and stop. And this idea of saying don't touch creates this little level of challenge for people to be able to navigate through the room without touching each other, and the kids love that. And then when I say stop, you pause standing in front of a partner And depending on the age and the proficiency level of the students, they will have to do something. And it could be this idea of find someone who, but I've done other things, just like greeting each other with a smile and looking each other in the eyes and finding out each other's name and using it. Something as simple, Nossa, something as simple as looking each other in the eye and greeting someone, looking the person in the eye can make such a difference to that connection that you have with the person. So I would do that, and I would repeat the chant and would do this over and over again until you've spoken to at least 5 different people in the room. And yeah, again, you can use the same format to do so many different things. If you want to hand out little flashcards and get them to find their partner, if you want to use it like a find someone who activity, you absolutely can. If you want to, oh, this is one that I did with my other group, which is really nice. In a previous lesson, we brainstormed a list of qualities that they love about themselves. And then we used this walk, don't touch activity for them to be able to walk around and compliment people, compliment each other after having learned these compliments in the previous lesson. It was a really nice way to start the lesson. And believe it or not, this activity was first invented for my pre-primary learners, who in a lot of course books, for some reason, in a lot of pre-primary course books, I was finding they were asking me to get students working in pairs. And anyone who knows anything about child development knows this is something that pre-primary learners are still learning how to do. So it was really difficult. So I had to try and help them learn how to interact with each other in class. And this walk, don't touch activity was a nice little introduction to that. But what I love about it is that it can be adapted to all ages and proficiency levels. And once they're familiar with the format, you can switch it up and use it, to practice the target language that you want to use for that lesson or anything. So in fact, I invite you to try this with your students in your next lesson and tell me how it went. Walk, don't touch. So there's one other thing that I should mention here. I can't see any other ideas in the chat here for group formation games, but I hope you do take some time to have a look for these. One more thing that I want to mention about group formation activities. Alba said an in and out. One of them said an in and out circle might, or could be another example. Can you explain the in and out circle to me? Alba, maybe you want to turn on your mic. My mic's enabled here.
Yeah, hello.
Hi, Alba.
Hi. Well, in and out circle is an activity where students go together and they do like 2 circles, the inside circle and the outside circle. And then you can put a music or whatever, and when it stops, the person that is right in front of you, you talk with that person, you make questions to know that person, and then students go changing the persons they are talking to. And
I love that.
Yeah.
I think it's it's a variation of this same concept of the find someone who or the walk and touch. Wonderful, wonderful. I think that's a really nice idea. Thank you so much for sharing. Laura here has a question about writing collaborative activities. A collaborative writing activity. Does anyone here in the group have an example of a collaborative writing activity? Do you mean like getting them to write something collaboratively? Laura, if you want to open up your mic, feel free. So I'm going to assume that's what you mean. I don't have any particular examples off the top of my head of doing collaborative writing activities as a group formation activity. In fact, I do think though that using these group formation games would help you build the kind of relationships with your students that would make getting them writing anything collaboratively a lot more effective and successful. Again, the whole point of the group formation activities is to try and have students feel a connection and feel a sense of belonging and a sense of community in the group, this is actually a really good moment to talk about, Lauda just mentioned Jamboard, using a Jamboard for collaborative writing. I think that's a nice idea, but it's a little bit different to the idea of this group formation. One of the other things I think it's worth mentioning here, with another quality that I really love about group formation activities, a really good group formation activity, you know what it has? It has this sense of the group succeeding together. Not all of them, like the walk, don't touch, there's not this moment where the whole group goes, yes. But another game, the broken telephone, for example, is a game where you line the students up and they have to try and pass a message or a gesture. It doesn't have to be verbal. You pass a gesture or a sentence from person to person. They have to whisper in the person's ear who's standing directly in front of them, and it gets passed down the line. And they have to try and be faithful to that, so that by the time it reaches the person at the front of the line, that person says it out loud and it should be the same as the original sentence or gesture. So if you've watched students do this, and it can be really tricky, and they fail and they try again, and they fail and they try again, and they fail and they get it, that moment when the group has come together, they've worked on something, they've collaborated together, and they have succeeded together, that shared success is a really powerful community builder. And I don't think when we're using too much competition, we tend not to have that moment. And in fact, when we're doing small group work, this idea of having the whole group working together and succeeding at something together is really, really powerful. And I think it's another characteristic of a really good group formation activity that's worth trying. Now, there's one more. There's one more thing that's really worth mentioning here, and this sounds counterintuitive, but an effective group formation activity isn't necessarily one that uses language at all. Like I mentioned with the broken telephone activity, you can have them passing a gesture down the line. It doesn't have to be verbal. You must take into consideration the age, the interests, but most importantly, the language proficiency of your learners. So in the language classroom, when you're choosing a group formation activity, the objective isn't necessarily, it really shouldn't be about teaching or practicing language. Sometimes you can, and I'm going to give you examples of activities where you do have a higher level of linguistic challenge or a higher level of language production, not linguistic challenge. In the language classroom, what you need to do is make sure that the level of challenge is somewhere, let me find a better way of wording this, making sure that the linguistic challenge is at a level where even your lowest level proficiency student can contribute and participate successfully. You know, so sometimes this does mean a no language production game. No speaking at all. And that might be rather controversial advice to give so many language teachers, but in my experience, creating moments of fun and friendship can radically transform the way your students interact with each other. And this in turn leads to a significant increase in the productivity and the learning that happens during the rest of the lesson. So taking 5 minutes to do a non-verbal game can really have a huge impact on students. Think about it. You are that student. This happens all the time in so many language classrooms that I've observed, that the class starts off with a recap of vocabulary, and the students who got it last lesson still get it and they're doing really well, but the students who didn't get it last lesson still don't get it. And they're starting off every class feeling like English is something that they're no good at, that they can't do, that everyone in the room knows it. And that has a negative impact, a direct negative impact on how they will feel and behave for the rest of your lesson. And let me tell you something, not just with kids, a lot of people have a mindset where when something gets hard, they don't ask for help. They would rather say, I don't want to, rather than I can't. So my advice is to make sure that you take this into consideration also when searching online for games and activities to use with your students. So when we have a look over here, someone mentioned Kahoot. Well, look at the wonderful sharing and collaboration going on in the chat here. I love this. Fantastic. Thank you so much for your participation. So using Jamboards, using these writing activities, for this to be effective at improving your sense of community, belonging, and the relationships in your room, you need to make sure that every single person in that room can participate successfully in the activity and succeed at it. We're just about out of time, but I will share this with you. I've actually got, I think it's like a six-page document with lots of examples of group formation games with low or no linguistic challenge, some mid-linguistic challenge, and actually some of you might have higher proficiency level students. So we've got some other sort of activities there that I think you could use really successfully in your activities. That's a direct download. You don't have to give me your email. You don't have to sign up for anything. It's just go ahead and feel free to download that. If you're watching this on your phone and you can't scan this QR code, you can use the bit.ly, the link there. It's group formation PDF. I'll pop that there. Yeah, so go ahead. Oh, you're very welcome. I'm really happy to be able to share this concept with other people. You might like to take a screenshot of these are sort of things that I've referred to, and some extra things there that you might like to take a look at for anyone who's interested in some of the topics that I brought up here. Before we get to the Q&A, I guess my final thoughts on this is really just thanking you all for being here and for listening to this topic, this workshop. I hope that I've managed to convince you about the value of using group formation activities to increase confidence and trust and cooperation and bring that fun and friendship back into every lesson. If you do try something out on Monday, I hope that you do. I hope that you can find at least one activity there that will work in your context, or that could be adapted to your context. I hope you try it out in your next class. And if you do, I would absolutely love to hear from you, to hear about it so we could connect. You are very welcome to join us over on Instagram. That is my Instagram account. It's Active English for Kids. And we have a brand new platform as well that we've just opened up where teachers we've got study groups, we've got lives going on, we've got huge recommended reading lists, we've got job opportunities being advertised there, and just lots of discussions on pre-primary, primary and bilingual education going on in different rooms. So if you are looking for a community, if you want to connect to a community, this might be the one for you, and I'd love to have you join us there. It's been a pleasure being here for obvious reasons. You know, my connection to Catalonia is very, very strong. Some of the best years of my life were in Catalonia. I certainly grew up professionally there. So it was such an honor, a genuine honor to be invited to come and speak at this event. And I hope you're all having a great time, and we'll have a really successful end of conference after this session here. I am opening up now for questions and discussion. So if you want to stick around and chat some more to me about this, exchange ideas, talk about problems that you're having, or come up, share more solutions, then I'm going to be here for the next 10 minutes. So we can get this, we can open up our mics now and get a discussion going if that's what you're interested in. If not, thank you so much for being here. And yeah, it's been a pleasure.